Nondescript, a face from the crowd, he is responsible for the deaths of countless millions worldwide and for the extermination of 6 million Jews. And yet he could play happily with animals and children and even worry about the most humane way to cook lobsters.
I must say, he was a very friendly, polite, and charming man in his private way. And it's hard to believe, but it's true.
Well, I believe that Hitler was a Superman, something like a second God. And I couldn't understand anyone who couldn't see that. Who is immediately responsible for the murder of my parents? One man, Hitler. It would not have happened without him. So it came from that mind that sprang the decision to murder my parents together with the many, many nameless millions who disappeared in the gas chambers of the extermination camps.
He left us Germans with an undigestible part of our lives and of the life of the third and fourth generation, which may be forgotten, can hardly be forgiven, and is still not understood.
The Berlin Sports Palace, destroyed by war, was the scene of Hitler's triumphs of persuasion.
Marschieren Geist in unseren Reihen mit. You felt uplifted by it. You felt like marching. And with it, of course, you felt like marching into other countries too. That thought came too. Yes, to show them we can sing these songs and there's greatness in it. I know now it's all foolish, but these psychological feelings one got with singing these songs and thinking about what they meant.
How did a civilized nation become enthralled by this man? The most difficult task for today's Germans is to try and understand how their parents fell under this enchantment. To admit the power of Hitler's appeal still causes pain.
Weil wir Deutschen uns klar werden wollen über das Verständnis unserer Geschichte und über Lehren für die politische Gestaltung unserer Gegenwart und Zukunft. Die Opfer, bitte lassen Sie diese würdige Stunde in dieser Form ablaufen. bitte Sie um Verständnis dafür, dass ich Sie herzlich bitte, jetzt sich ruhig zu verhalten.
The outrage, which greeted an attempt by the Bundestag president to explain the dangerous lure of the Nazis, cost him his job. By describing German tolerance for Hitler's crimes against the Jews, he was mistakenly thought to share it.
It gave one the creeps while I listened to it, and it doesn't necessarily if you read the speech. Feelings bordering to hysteria were unleashed, and he had to retire. Which just shows you that after 40, 50 years, these things are terribly alive.
Verständlicherweise fühlten sich natürlich viele Juden in aller Welt durch diese Rede angesprochen. Sie haben davon gehört, manche zunächst einmal mit Entsetzen, haben befürchtet, dass es in Deutschland wieder Antisemitismus gibt und dass da jemand, ein Politiker, so haben viele gemeint, war die Nazis rechtfertigen, Hitler rechtfertigen würde. Ich habe genau das Gegenteil getan.
The danger of Hitler was his seductive modernity. His propaganda could present a totalitarian message with the flair of democratic persuasion. The first politician to take to the air, he was also a political tactician who could trade his command of the crowds for real political power.
Das Gewoge von Menschen, der Gau Berlin hat an 10 öffentlichen Plätzen große Riesenlautsprecher aufgestellt. Und von diesen Lautsprechern nun ballen sich die Menschenmauern zusammen, um Zuhörer zu sein der großen Rede, die unser...
Once he got control of the airwaves, he could reach an audience of 20 million. They too could share in his climactic rallies, which modern media organizers now regard with awe.
Watching Hitler being brought in through the crowd was quite interesting because we're only just now beginning in political and commercial terms to use the same kind of presentational techniques that Hitler was using 40 and 50 years ago. Quite legitimate techniques. And he knows exactly the mood of his audience, which means he studied it very carefully. He's actually obeying the basic principles of public speaking, of knowing your audience, knowing what they're looking for, knowing what you want them to do. But now, all this time I've been talking, he hasn't said a word.
Am 30. Januar dieses Jahres wurde die neue Regierung der nationalen Konzentration gewählt.
You see time and again, standing still, quiet. And then when he decides to build up the emotional bit later on in the speech, you can actually feel him doing it deliberately.
Einen Kampfziel erhoben. Damals erhob ich mir zum ersten Mal als unbekannter Heiser auf diesen Krieg zu beginnen und mich zu ruhen, bis endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben befreit sein durfte.
Members of the audience, particularly women, were brought to a state of frenzy which in some ways resembled an orgasm. And I could see how these people forgot all about their dignity, their status and so forth, and began to loosen up and to scream and shout and to take notice of each other and the animal contact and so forth.
Yes, it was like that, because in a big hall and the speech being made, you cannot always quite follow it.
And there were occasions where one Heil, 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 and everyone shouted too. And then you said to your next door neighbor, "Now, what did he say?" But you shouted it first.
Eine, zwei, 3 Millionen, 4 Millionen, 5 Millionen, 6 Millionen, 7 Millionen. Heute möge es 7 bis 8 Millionen tatsächlich sein. So sieht es heute in Deutschland aus, unter dem Regiment. Diese Parteien, die 40 Jahre lang unser Volk ruinierten. Das ist nun die Frage, wie lange noch?
My father said to me, as he always did, "There's a chair, sit down, keep your mouth shut, your ears open, learn something." And they read the text, and Hitler had a pencil in his hand and said, this was good, play that up. This didn't go so well, you can cut that. And Goebbels made 1 or 2 suggestions, and I was astonished that the man who had less than half an hour before been in a frenzy of emotion himself and whipped up the audience to absolute hysteria should be capable of sitting there and coolly assessing his own speech from a point of view of the propagandistic effectiveness.
He also offered ritual, the thrill of immersion in a vast pagan rite which still had the familiar overtones of religious practice, well remembered by the former Catholic choir boy from Lamberg. At the age of 6, Hitler had joined the choir of this Benedictine monastery. He later wrote, "I had excellent opportunity to intoxicate myself with the solemn splendor of the brilliant church festivals."
I am inclined to think that these early experiences as a choir boy exposed to the original had a very powerful impact. You might say he took over elements and then kind of homespun his own religion.
Hitler offered himself as a new Messiah, and the Germans embraced this dubious salvation.
In some kindergartens, they had the prayer for the little children of 3 or 4 years. Händchen falten, Köpfchen senken und an Adolf Hitler denken. Now translated. You can't. It is so ridiculous. It's just, we laugh, but that is what's dangerous.
What then are the clues to this man's inflated vision of himself? His parents lived in the Austrian border town of Braunau am Inn, where his authoritarian father was a customs official. Hitler's mother, Clara, was her husband's niece and servant before she married him. She bore 3 children, all of whom died within a month of each other. Then, on the 20th of April, 1889, she bore a child who was to survive. She called him Adolf.
So Adolf became, as I see it, very important to her. And she formed a very, very close tie. And I think this is one source of this enormous sense of importance, even of maybe having a mission and of being free and destined to do anything he wanted, which I think is one of the major characteristics of Adolf.
Although Hitler had dreams of becoming an artist, he neglected to do any work at school. He devoted himself instead to a fantasy world founded on the music and romantic ideals of Wagner, in which he rebuilt on a grandiose scale Linz, the city where he had failed so badly. It was to be a theme to which he returned again and again whenever reality threatened to crush his fantasies. His lofty hopes of entering the art academy were to be destroyed. His mother's death removed the one person who had believed in him. He fled reality yet further when his drawings failed to secure him a place at the academy. Pretending to be a student, he drifted hopelessly before finding sanctuary among the dossers of this Viennese men's home. He later claimed that in Vienna he formed the granite foundation of his worldview. Among the vagrants, he developed his lasting obsession with race. The Germans, as the master race of Central Europe, he felt, were threatened by the influx of inferior races, the Slavs, and especially the Jews. All human life, he thought, was struggle and war. And when war broke out in 1914, he was in Munich to welcome it. An ecstatic face in the crowd, he enrolled at once in the German army. War suited him. For the first time, he belonged. He was wounded and won an Iron Cross, but remained a corporal. His officers could find no leadership potential in him. He was still the face in the crowd. In the last summer of the war, he was caught in a British gas attack and temporarily blinded. He recovered in hospital as Germany abruptly collapsed before her territory was even invaded. In 1918, the German people suffered a defeat they had never believed possible and an attempted revolution by the left, which caused bitter division. The new republic had to struggle with the loss of territory and the reparations imposed by the Allies at Versailles. There was runaway inflation and the constant threat of civil war. These were the years of crisis in which Hitler discovered his extraordinary talent as a speaker, and in 1923 made his first and only attempt at seizing power by force in a coup. It was a hopeless failure for which Hitler received a lenient sentence behind bars. There he held court with his followers and wrote a political testament from which he never departed. Revenge for Versailles, the capture of more living space at the expense of Russia, the creation of a new 1,000-year empire in the East, the native Slavs reduced to the status of slaves, and the total exclusion of Jews. His own role in this, and the National Socialist Party he now led, was clear. He was to be number one in a party on the political margins. And then the slump of 1929, which lost millions their jobs, gave Hitler a second chance as the demagogue who could blame it all on the guilty men of 1918.
Alles angestiftet und alles gemacht und alles verantwortet von den Männern des Novembers 1918.
Hitler's Nazis mixed the threat of revolution and the promise of legality. He never achieved a majority, but just when his vote was falling, the old German elite borrowed his mass movement for their own ends. Hitler was to be chancellor in a coalition government appointed by the aged President Hindenburg. We've heard him, they said, as Hitler came soberly to office, that he was using them.
I was 10 years old when he came to power, and much of Hitler's speaking was about that. das Diktat from Versailles. We've got to throw those chains off and free ourselves. And within the diktat from Versailles, putting the chains around us, of course, there were the Jews and the Bolsheviks and the plutocrats, and we got to wipe them off Europe and establish our beautiful society, which will be lovely for human beings.
Morgentraining in der Gymnastikschule Wedau.
Most Germans abandoned themselves to the dream. The nightmare was to follow.
It was a great feeling. You felt you belonged to something great. You felt you belonged to a great nation which now find its feet again. Germany now was in good, safe hands, and I was going to help and build a strong Germany. A lovely feeling. But my father, of course, thought differently about it.
The new regime struck hard. Empowered by an enabling act, it seized communists, socialists, and trade unionists. Brown-shirted stormtroopers reminded everyone of the dangers of dissent.
From then on, father said to me, now, Henry, don't say what I am saying here to you, because I always argued with my father. By then I was in the Hitler Youth, and I was very much for the Hitler regime. That was against all his feeling, his background as a conscious working man.
Cleverly exploiting the generation gap, propaganda portrayed the left as thugs.
Was ist das gelernt? Was?
Du lass doch den Jungen, ja, der wird es
Was heißt das so, wenn hier was gesungen wird? Was singt er? Hört die Signale auf zum letzten. Einmal. Hört die Signale auf zum letzten. Kannst du nicht singen, doch?
Very shortly after Hitler came to power, the press was muzzled. That was censored. So you could read of nothing of what was going on. But therefore, all these experiences of the other side, the black side of National Socialism, I think I have to come to you personally. Nothing was reported except enormous headlines of Hitler's progress and prowess.
And there was economic progress. Rearmament, labor service, and public works transformed Germany, helped by an improving world economy. 5 million were put back to work, but trade unions and strikes were outlawed. The dictatorship worked.
Das war ein Mann, der mir geschrieben hat, ich war viele Jahre arbeitslos und ich hätte, so drückte er sich aus, mit dem Teufel einen Pakt abgeschlossen, wenn ich Arbeit bekommen hätte. Und dann kam Hitler. Und ich habe Arbeit bekommen und dann bin ich ihm nachgelaufen.
The devil was plain to see. Jews were first boycotted, then harassed. Jewish authors' books were burned in the name of German culture, which was personified by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Der Durchbruch der deutschen Revolution.
We knew as schoolboys about Dachau, for instance. We knew about Oranienburg, and we knew about Dachau. And there was a ditty which we all repeated, including people who later disclaimed all knowledge of that sort of thing. And the ditty went like this. Lieber Gott, mach mich stumm, dass ich nicht nach Dachau komme. Which means, dear God, strike me dumb so that I shan't be sent to Dachau.
My personal feeling about concentration camps, and that of all my schoolmates and my friends in the Hitler Youth, was that anti-Reich elements that were being put there into those concentration camps, and for the first time in their lives probably, they were made to work for Germany. And these elements, they were, of course, communists and Jews and homosexuals and Bible punchers and thieves and robbers and these sort of people. And I personally felt, right, have them into a concentration camp, make them work. About brutalities and torture or so, I didn't give it any thought, and I never had heard anything.
Hitler held power by a combination of terror and propaganda. At this stage, there was little killing. The camps were filmed as correction centers for the antisocial. Meanwhile, other Germans could relax. Life was good to them.
With all the successes Hitler had, Germany was actually a wonderful place to be alive, unless you were Jewish, you had strong political convictions, either as a socialist or as a communist, or you believed in individuality and the freedom of the individual. But that never is the majority of any people.
No, there was no resistance movement, and there couldn't be. Nowhere in the world can develop a resistance movement, and people feel better from day to day. No, resistance were stones in a torrent. And the water crashed just over us.
Every Nazi ritual was designed to enhance the myth of an unstoppable and glorious movement. The feeble reality of Hitler's 1923 coup was transformed by its elaborate commemoration of supposed martyrs to an eternal, even divine cause.
I think Hitler was compensating for a very deep sense of inferiority by living in a world of fantasy, of grandiose fantasies. But what is so terrifying and so awful is that he was able actually to put those grandiose fantasies into practice so that they no longer seemed mad. I mean, he reminds one so very much of people in mental hospitals who say, oh, I own the banks, I own the world, I'm the most powerful man in the world. But the thing was, he made this come true. And that is what's so horrifying.
Hitler expanded his power with ruthless political skill. He built up the black-shirted SS as the instrument of his terror. He used it to purge its predecessors, the street gangsters of the SA. Heinrich Himmler became the chief executioner. Among the victims were Ernst Röhm, once Hitler's closest colleague, Gregor Strasser, the radical Nazi, and former Chancellor Schleicher. The army and Hitler's right-wing allies were appeased.
Da hat sich mit Blut vollgeschaut und einer Maske umgeben, die ihm sagte, was der Mensch den alle fürchten müssen. Eine teuflische Figur. Hitler resembled many of the people that we know of as sadistic murderers. People like the Ripper, and people like Dennis Nielsen, all of whom were isolated people. His isolation showed itself in the fact that he couldn't make relationships, and therefore he didn't care about other people at all. They were expendable. And that's very characteristic of sadistic murderers.
Apart from his mother, the one person to whom Hitler does seem to have been close was his niece, Gerli Raubel. She was the daughter of the only member of his family whom he openly acknowledged, his sister Angela, who came to keep house for him in Munich. Gelli became Hitler's constant companion on outings and picnics, sharing the lazy bohemian lifestyle of a Nazi leader before he came to power. Then on the 18th of September 1931, in the flat which they shared, Gelli shot herself with one of Hitler's pistols and bled to death. Hitler was on his way to a political meeting when he heard the news. He returned immediately amidst a flurry of rumors. 4 days later, he issued a statement in the press denying any responsibility for her death.
He seems to have been close to suicide after the suicide of Geli Raubal. It's not uninteresting that at least 5 women committed suicide who saw themselves as being somehow close to Hitler.
And no other person was spoken so often after she was dead than Geli Raubal. And I think she was the most important woman for him. I don't know about his mother, but Geli Raubal's place never was replaced in his mind or in his heart.
At the Nuremberg trials, Hermann Goering said that Hitler was never the same after Gelli's death, and that it altered his relationships to all other people.
And I had the feeling that he was not interested in somebody who was really at his level or superior to him. I think he was very fond of people who listened to him and admired him and listened to his stories and his monologues and his philosophies. And all those people he had, they all admired him. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody had another opinion in important things.
In the 20s, when I still called him Onkel Dolph, I was always very happy when he came. He was a fascinating playmate. The railroad was our favorite game. I was the train, and he would be on his hands and knees, and I would crawl under him and make circles around the room, and he would furnish a running commentary. A cattle car on this train. He would imitate the grunting of pigs, the noise of sheep, goats, the moving of cows. We would pull out again, and it was just great stuff.
I think it's very characteristic of isolated and lonely people who don't have relationships on equal terms with their peers, but they get on better with the young, the weak, the inferior, as long as they don't feel threatened or anybody is attacking their authority, then they feel that they can afford to be kind and generous. And many people thought that Hitler was kind and generous to children and to women.
Despite 2 suicide attempts, one woman stayed with him to the end. Eva Braun was the Aryan ideal.
He admired Eva Braun as a very warm-hearted, natural girl who has courage and fidelity. I think that was very important. He used to say, there are 2 beings I can trust, that's my dog and Eva Braun.
His actual sexual life seems to have been very meager, because the occasions when he had contact with Eva Braun have been very few. It seems that Goebbels tried to provide him with women, and in contrast to Goebbels himself, he seemed to have been not particularly interested. I think power, the enjoyment of power, became so much more important for him than sex.
My bride is Germany, Hitler once admitted. So too, he demanded from the army a unique oath of loyalty, not to the state, but to him personally. He now became the Fuhrer with powers of life and death.
He caught this army with that lasso and made the best use of it, and the army never noticed.
he was a Vabonk player whose slogan, like that of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, could have been "Go for broke," as in the case of the occupation of the demilitarized zone of the Rhine, where all the generals said, we have 2 hours ammunition and we can't risk that. If the French march, we're done. And he said, they won't march. I know it. And if it goes wrong, I shall not survive it. And you couldn't disbelieve this.
As the Rhineland gamble progressed, Hitler, now the undisputed leader of 67 million people, made an extraordinary remark. I follow my course with the security and precision of a sleepwalker.
I think it is a very good comparison because a sleepwalker is in a very dangerous position, actually, because he walks on the very edge or ridge of the roof, and he would fall down in the moment you disturb him.
The dice were hot for Hitler for so many years. He took so many chances, and they came off. So that even the very diffident Reichswehr generals finally more or less said, this man can't lose.
After Austria, it was the turn of the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia, whose German population welcomed Hitler with flowers after the ruin of the Czechs at Munich. But when Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939, his dream of an Eastern Empire became apparent.
Munich was the last rose of Hitler's summer, and Prague was the beginning of the end, when Hitler turned to pieces the Munich arrangement and entered with troops in Prague and told to Hebel and to his people that in 3 weeks nobody would talk about this. But of course, that was a decisive step from a national prophet to an imperialist conqueror.
But Hitler, with the gambler's exultant glee, mocked his foreign critic Roosevelt, who had warned him against attacking the countries he now listed.
Finnland, Lettland, Litauen, Estland, Slowenien, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina.
Half of those countries would be laid waste by his armies and air. With the youth of Germany brainwashed for death and sacrifice in war, Hitler was impatient to test his armies in a war of conquest. At 50, plagued with nervous illness, he wanted to conquer Eastern Europe. Russia was bought off with a non-aggression pact before he attacked Poland. But to his surprise, this brought war with Britain and France. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, brought victory on all fronts. Versailles was avenged.
Some saw him half God, put him on the altar. To others, it was like a drunken postman.
After the fall of France, Hitler stood on a peak of popular acclaim. Although Britain still defied him, he decided to open up the war on a second front in Russia.
In the teaching of history was a different emphasis. There was already the wish to enlarge Germany towards the east. And the east was our future. And German tribes in the Middle Ages and before had been there. And it was more or less our right to go there because the Slavs, anyway, they were second rate and third rate. Just listen to the name, Slav. They are no alien people like we. But I believed that I was superior to people of other nations and that it was a kind of God-given duty to me to pump sense into them, to go out like the early Christians, I suppose, and force them to accept my way, because that is a better way for them, even they cannot be as intelligent as I to understand why that is.
The Slavs were now to provide the slaves Hitler had always envisaged would serve the master race of colonists. German soldiers discovered too late what manner of war this was and where their oath had taken them.
In the beginning of German occupation of Warsaw, the Warsaw schools went on. And there had been moments when suddenly, during the break in the school curriculum, people with machine guns would drive in, Germans, and shoot whole forms of boys. I can't believe it. I'm sorry. It is unimaginable. On the proof we have by now about occupation of Poland, I think there's no way out of it. I believe it.
Hitler had spelled it out. This was to be a war of extermination.
Und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
The Jews had been harassed from the beginning. Now they were to be hunted down and killed.
They hated Jews, they didn't like Jews. They wanted to turn them into second-class citizens, perhaps even go that far to force them into emigration in some fairly acceptable way. But to actually go and murder men, women, and children, that was Hitler.
As Hitler pondered his ever larger plans for world domination, he must have heard the rumors that his father might have been half Jewish. Although Alois Hitler's secrets had gone with him to the grave, once his son Adolf became master of Austria, he made sure the house in which his father had been born was destroyed. The propaganda prepared German soldiers for the pitiless tasks that lay ahead of them in the East. Under Goebbels' supervision, propaganda films assailed the Jews.
Das häusliche Zusammenleben der Juden zeigt einen auffallenden Mangel an selbstschöpferischer Zivilisationsfähigkeit. Auf Deutsch gesagt, die jüdischen Behausungen sind unsauber und verwahrlost.
While the majority of Germans might not want to kill Jews, they accepted a regime that typecast them as human vermin, and many helped this madness to flourish.
I had not the slightest notion about the development in the future. I never imagined such consequences. Naturally, I regret having been involved in this.
Natürlich wissen sich diese Ghetto-Juden zunächst noch nicht richtig in den sauberen europäischen Anzügen zu bewegen. Etwas besser können es diese Berliner Juden. Ihre Väter und Großväter haben zwar auch noch im Ghetto gelebt, aber davon merkt man nun äußerlich nichts mehr.
The idea that Jews could assume any disguise led to often random orgies of killing. But in 1943, the systematic extermination of Jews began.
The anti-Semitism has not as a logical consequence a mass murder of Jews. The anti-Semitism has different causes, religious causes, and so on.
If we look at the Holocaust, at all the horrors that happened, obviously Hitler couldn't have done that on his own. He had to find the people willing to serve his ends.
I happened to be present in the Western Ukraine in late 42, when what they, I mean the powers, being called the action, the action, which was a mass drive beginning at the river Dnieper westward to exterminate Jews. This was before Auschwitz, before the poisoning, the gassing, and they shot in 2 days an estimated 1,800 in that little city. I believe I was 23 or 24, and the knowledge I had led me very soon, very quickly, to understand it's number one. It's Adolf, who somewhere, we didn't know the word mafia, but nowadays, in a mafia way, is responsible. And only if he goes, they might have a chance, and the armed forces and the services might have a chance to be mentally again out of this spell.
Axel von dem Busche tried to get close enough to Hitler with a bomb that would have killed both of them. Like several brave attempts before him, he failed. Not until 1944, at Rastenburg, did one almost succeed. But its only effect was to force a rare public appearance from the vengeful recluse that Hitler had become as the tide of war turned against him. The German savior imagined he had been preserved to continue his mission of destruction. By night and day, Allied aircraft pounded the Reich without respite. Cocooned in his underground bunker, Hitler was immune to the effects of his war.
I told him that it was terrible, all the burning houses, and people lost their home and anything to eat, and it was cold. And I just was so full of pity that I tried to express that to him. And he listened to me with a very stern face. And then the only thing he said, wait, we will pay them back everything. He never saw a bombed German city. He was not interested in seeing that. He never had an impression of what he really did, what happened.
Now the Germans had to pay for their infatuation. Hitler had always underestimated the Russians and their climate.
Many of us, yes, we were saying it would be a great thing to die for the fatherland and to die on the battlefield, but I don't think that anyone ever gave real thought to the practical side of it, what it would involve. Somebody said, okay, now you have to die. But it was imprinted into our minds. We were fooled in a big way.
At Stalingrad, Hitler sacrificed 250,000 men who could have been saved to fight again.
The report from the fronts gave a terrible picture. That was for the first time that Hitler really broke down and gave the war lost. He broke out in tears, and then immediately he started to accuse the Wehrmacht, the military, and also the generals that they hadn't believed in his mission.
For the crime of losing faith in his mission, Hitler decreed a terrible punishment for the Germans. By 2 Fuhrer orders, he condemned Germany to national death. The enemy, he ordered, was to find nothing but death, annihilation, and hatred.
He was the greatest egotist possible. He didn't care for the fate of his surrounding, and especially also not for the fate of his nation. And if he had to die, then the German people should perish too.
He didn't separate himself from Germany. He just identified the whole movement that he'd created. And either it came off as a splendid success or it ended in dust and ashes. And it didn't much matter which, because as long as he was finding scope for his grandiose plans, as long as he was building Valhalla, as it were, then Götterdämmerung could come and destroy the whole thing.
Dies sind die ersten Wochenschauraufnahmen des Endkampfs in Berlin.
The end was suitably Wagnerian.
Was in the bunker of the big Vice Chancellery, there was a room, and there was built up a model of the planning of Linz. And he stood there and looked at it and explained the details and was so happy and just as if it would become reality. I could hardly believe it. The Russians were outside and bombing, burning.
Hitler now married Eva Braun in the bunker. She would share his suicide the same day, but first he dictated his last testament.
I expected Hitler to excuse himself and to regret what he had done, at least to give an explanation, or even once, and the last time in his life, to blame himself of a mistake, at least that he started the Second Front War with Russia. But he, in the contrary, he accused everybody else and he blamed everybody else. And I think that he blamed even the German people who sacrificed so much in this war.
The teacher lecturing boys nowadays about history has to reckon with a boy of 18 saying, "And what did you do, sir?"
I followed the crowd, I obeyed commands, and I have learned in my later life that by doing that, I have made a horrendous mistake.
This program has been made possible by viewers like you. This is PBS. From Japan to Korea, America's influence in Asia continued to grow after World War II. In 1950, the United States was ready for peace. Yet a consuming fear of communist expansion propelled America into Korea, the unknown war. You've seen